technology problems as usual. So today's lesson is going to be a little introduction on the World War I poet Wilfred Owen, probably one of the most famous war poets that we know and love today, and his poems are still very much read throughout the world. So, our word of the day is disarmament. So all the words and spellings over the next week while we're studying war poetry will be based on war. So today's word is disarmament. So obviously to disarm, you just have to think of that when you're trying to spell it. So it means the reduction or withdrawal of military forces or troops and weapons. So an example would be the public wanted peace and disarmament once and for all. Hallelujah. Today's spelling word, sabotage. So that'll be added on to the spelling list. We're going to have a spelling bee in a couple of weeks' time. So I'll be publishing a list of words for you to practice over the weekend. As usual, I love my little cheesy puns. Only applies if you're a Harry Potter fan. Stop that now. I'm serious. Anyway. Right, so Wilfred Owen. He was born in 1883 and he tragically died in 1918. His full name is Wilfred Edward Salter Owen. He was born in Shropshire in 1883 to a middle-class family. He was the eldest of 3 children and his dad was called Tom. He was a railway clerk and his mum, Susan, was very religious. She had a great religious background and attended church regularly and practiced that at home. So because of that, Owen was also very quite religious and read the Bible on a daily basis. He was actually going to have a job in the church, but unfortunately couldn't attend university, so he had to change his career path. His early life, so his granddad died and the family were sort of forced to move house, so they ended up renting a place in Birkenhead, and even as a child Owen showed a talent and an interest in music and poetry. However, as I said, they couldn't afford to send him to university, although he was clever enough to go, so he started off his working life as a teaching assistant right after school. So a little timeline then on his life. So in 1913, Owen went to France to teach English for a couple of years because of his change of career path. But he did return to England in 1915, where he volunteered to fight in the war. So he enlisted in the troops in the Manchester Regiment where he was commissioned. And that's where he spent, that's who he spent a year training with in England. In a letter home, he wrote, "The people of England needn't hope, they must agitate." And he was also known to have said, "I hate washy pacifists." So a pacifist is someone who doesn't believe in war and just wants to maintain peace. However, his perspective of that changed, or them changed, and he said, "I hate washy pacifists." So that sort of sums up his feelings and attitude at the time based on his experience of war. So although he was anti-war maybe before, obviously experiencing war changed his opinion, so he had a different point of view towards the people that weren't fighting, and he understood the true meaning behind war. Right, so his time at war. So on the 29th of December 1916, he was shipped out to France, and because of his background and his intelligence, within a couple of weeks he was actually commanding a platoon on the front line, so he was in charge. He spent almost 4 months with that one regiment before he, moving in and out of the front line. So obviously as soon as they were there, they were on the front line fighting at the front. And within a few days, a letter home to his mum read, "I have suffered 7th hell." So he didn't try to mince his words, basically he just said it as it was. He said to her that there was no point in trying to hide the truth. So he actually admitted how bad it was right from the beginning. So the damage of war was clearly having an impact on him, just as well as the other troops. So in the midst of the heavy gunfire, the troops faced horrendous conditions, which is obviously one of the key themes that recur throughout his poems, wading for miles through trenches that were often 2 feet in water, and obviously you've heard of, or you hopefully have heard of, trench foot, so where the men had to get amputated feet and things because of the conditions, and wallowing in mud a lot, sleeping in mud, sleeping standing up, rats everywhere, so the conditions were horrific. And a lot of his poems describe that, again, he just describes the true harsh realities of war on the front line. And obviously some of his poems, including his most famous, describe the constant fear and threat of gas attacks at the time. So obviously all of that would have a traumatising impact on anybody, and obviously the same applied to him. So this constant barrage of attacks and fear and conditions did have an impact on his mental health, which he did relate to his mum in letters home. On the 2nd of May 1917, he was unfortunately diagnosed with shell shock. So obviously that's, if you've been through a trauma or traumatising things, that's quite what a lot of the soldiers suffered from, and he was declared as unfit to lead his troops. So because of that, he was actually sent back to Britain. So in June 1917, so the next month, he was actually sent to a hospital in Craiglockhart, which is near Edinburgh, and that's where he spent 4 months being treated by a team of doctors who were renowned for being amazing at treating soldiers with similar issues, and obviously the psychological trauma that they had all experienced. During his hospital stay, it was actually turned into more of a positive thing in his life, ironically, where he spent the 4 months and he actually met Siegfried Sassoon, who was another famous war poet. And he had a reputation, he was quite well known even at that time, unlike Owen, who was obviously just sort of starting to write himself. Sassoon offered him valuable support and encouragement in his writing and in life, and they had similar views on war, which is why they obviously formed that friendship based on their love of literature and writing, and obviously they had both experienced the same situation in war. So Sassoon had a great influence on Wilfred Owen, and that transformed Owen's life. Reading his works, Sassoon's work, and looking at his own work, his own poems, started to make Wilfred Owen have a wee rethink about the way he was writing. So he actually started changing his writing style, the structure of his poems slightly altered. So he spent quite a bit of time rewriting previous poems and obviously writing new ones, because Sassoon encouraged Owen to look at the impact of shell shock and to try and write about it. Because obviously some of you might have written about your own traumas in life, if you're doing a personal reflective essay, sometimes it's good to get your feelings on the page. It can be quite cathartic, so it's good for you. So I think that's one of the avenues that Wilfred Owen used to try and cope with all the horrible situations that he was experiencing, was to write them down. And that's obviously what he did with his constant letters home to his mum as well. After the 4-month stay in hospital, Owen returned to war, but he didn't go straight away back to France. He just returned to his regiment in Manchester, but he returned to France in August 1918. But by then, obviously, the things that he'd experienced and his time in hospital had changed his view of war. And at this point, just like before where he said about the washy pacifists, he became very critical of what he called the armchair patriots. So if you can see the little picture there's a couple of kids saying, "Daddy, what did you do to help in the Great War?" Because obviously if you're putting your own life on the line and you're surrounded by your troops who are doing the same, you would start to be a wee bit more critical of the people who weren't taking part, but who liked to talk the talk. Right, his death. So tragically, he was actually preparing his first set of poems when he was killed in action, when he was leading his troops in France, and he was killed on the 4th of November 1918, and he was only 25 years old. Just like a lot of the soldiers who were very young when they enlisted or were, or fought. He was only 25, so didn't have much experience of life at all, and that's obviously what one of the recurring themes is in his poems, as well as the young age and innocence of the men who are the soldiers who were killed. Ironically, on the 11th of November, so a week later, 1 week later, his parents received a telegram to tell them of his death. However, that was the same day as the signing of the armistice, and obviously that was the official ending of the war. So it's tragic that that actually happened just 1 week after his death. So after his death, he's obviously, just like a lot of painters, like artists, on canvas, who become very famous after their death. The same can be said for Wilfred Owen. So a lot of, he was an unknown poet through his active life, but then after his death, that's when his poems started to get published and, are still celebrated today and read very widely. So Owen realised that he couldn't help the generation that he was in, because obviously everybody was caught up in the war, but he was determined to warn the next generation to learn from the mistakes of the past, so that he hoped that no more war would happen. Obviously we know that is tragically not the case, but his poetic legacy certainly has a major impact today, and we can still learn a lot from his written word. So next week we're going to be studying Disabled. So that's one of his poems. There's a lot of his poems that are very well known now and famous and studied widely at school, but just for today I'm just going to read his most famous, I would say, of them all. As soon as you hear the words Wilfred Owen, this is the poem that everyone thinks of, and it's obviously one that's widely studied at school. Okay, so I'm sure you know, it's called Dulce Et Decorum Est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et Decorum Est, pro patria mori. And Dulce et Decorum Est, pro patria mori is a Latin term that just basically means that it is honourable to die for one's country, but obviously the word lie is the key idea here, that he knows that that is an untruth, and obviously the way he sells war is certainly, we're not going to be joining up anytime soon, are we, really? Alright, so that's just a little bit of background to Wilfred Owen and his life, his tragically short life. I hope you've learned some interesting information or things you maybe didn't know about him, and that's just a sort of stepping stone to lead us into reading some of his poems, and we're going to do Disabled. So over the weekend I will be uploading blank copies of the poem, which I would hope you can print off, and we're going to do some work on annotating poetry next week. I'm also going to put up some work for you to do on the first stanza, and if you can try and do it before Monday, that would be fabulous, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to start looking closely and analyse in depth the first few lines in the first stanza of the poem. So I hope you can join, and then eventually, once we've finished the poem, I'm going to teach you how to write, the way to structure a really effective critical essay. And obviously, if you're studying Nat 5 or higher, it's a really crucial tool to have, because that's a third of your exam, is to write a critical essay in time conditions. So it's really important you know what you're doing, and I'm going to take you through it step by step, just like I did with the persuasive essay. So right from how to do an introduction, how to structure the main body, we're going to do one together, and then how to write an effective conclusion, and any other tips I can share with you along the way, so that by the time you get back to school, or if you're already at school, by the time you get your next essay, you'll have a much clearer idea of what to do. Alright? If you haven't already done so, please like, subscribe, share, join my YouTube channel and the materials on the Aim Higher Facebook page. You can join if you go into groups and resources. If you're not on Facebook, there are the links to the Google Classroom, where I also upload all the materials and the presentations if you want to get access to them later on to your heart's content. And if you haven't done so, if you want to say thank you, that's what to do. Alright, so have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you on Monday for studying Disabled. Alexa, play.